All right, bandage is secure. Keep pressure on it.
Yes, Doc. When do I report back?
Wait here for reassignment.
We're critically low on plasma in Manila.
I know, sir. We're diverting what we can, but air transport is limited. All right, bandages changed. The doctor will see you in the morning. Just try and get some rest. 50 gross bandages accounted for.
Check. Next crate.
Keep it moving, gentlemen. That convoy leaves in the hour.
The room smells of antiseptic that isn't strong enough. A U.S. Army medic stands over a narrow cot, hands hovering, unsure what to do next. The wound itself is survivable. A deep gash, ragged but cleanable. The real danger isn't the blood. It's what might come after. Infection, fever, amputation. Death weeks later, far from the battlefield. Around him, shelves sit half empty. Gauze rolls are rationed. Bandages are reused when they shouldn't be. Sterile dressings, once taken for granted in peacetime America, have become precious. Every crate that arrives is counted. Every package is weighed against the next inevitable casualty. Across the country, similar scenes unfold. Training camps, naval hospitals, makeshift wards hurriedly assembled for a war that has only just begun. The United States has factories, steel, oil, and manpower. But in early 1942, it lacked something far more basic. Clean wounds, sterile supplies, time. And as millions of men prepare to go overseas, a quiet realization spreads through military medicine. America is entering a global war without the medical infrastructure to survive it, unless industry can transform faster than the war itself. Before December 1941, American medicine lived in a different rhythm. Hospitals were built for cities, not continents. Production schedules followed civilian demand, not mass casualties. Sterile gauze, surgical dressings, sutures, adhesive tape. These were manufactured steadily, predictably, in quantities that matched peacetime life. There was no reason to imagine otherwise. The United States had not fought a modern industrial war in over 2 decades. World War I had offered lessons, but those lessons had faded into reports and archives. Infection control had improved since 1918, but not enough to eliminate risk. Penicillin was still experimental, scarce, and not yet mass-produced. Sulfa drugs existed, but supplies were limited and unevenly distributed. Sterile wound care remained a frontline defense against death that arrived days after the injury. In Europe, war had already exposed the truth. British and German medical corps reported the same pattern by 1940. Men surviving artillery and bullets only to die later from infected wounds. Logistics determined survival as much as surgery. Gauze mattered. Clean bandages mattered. Sterility mattered. But the Atlantic separated those warnings from American planning. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, the U.S. military remained small. The Army Medical Department was structured for an army of fewer than 200,000 men. By mid-1940, even as war raged across Europe, American mobilization remained cautious. Production increases focused on weapons, vehicles, and aircraft. Medical logistics sat lower on the priority list, important but assumed manageable. Then came Pearl Harbor. On December 7th, 1941, the United States did not simply enter the war. It accelerated into it. Within weeks, the size of the armed forces began expanding at a speed no American institution had ever experienced. Training camps multiplied across the country. Hospitals were expanded overnight. Medical personnel were drafted, reassigned, and rushed through accelerated programs. And with every new soldier came an unavoidable truth. Each one represented a future wound. The Army Medical Department quickly understood the scale of the problem. Projections showed millions of casualties across all theaters: combat wounds, training accidents, tropical diseases, burns, and infections. The Pacific alone promised conditions worse than Europe: humidity, heat, bacteria, and long supply lines that magnified every shortage. What the planners discovered was unsettling. The United States did not have stockpiles of sterile medical supplies large enough for sustained global war. Most dressings were produced by a handful of companies operating on commercial timelines. Sterilization processes were labor-intensive, slow, and designed for hospitals, not armies moving across oceans. Even worse, imports from Europe, once a quiet backbone of specialized medical materials, had collapsed. Shipping lanes were dangerous. Factories overseas were bombed or repurposed. America was suddenly alone, medically self-reliant, and underprepared. In January 1942, reports from military hospitals began to repeat the same language: critical shortages, rationing, improvised reuse. Infection rates threatened to climb before the first major American landings even occurred. The war had not yet reached full violence for American forces, but the medical system was already under strain, and it was only the beginning. And somewhere between procurement offices and factory floors, a question began to take shape. Who exactly could scale cleanliness for war? By early 1942, the shortage stopped being theoretical. Inside the Army Medical Department, daily reports began to show patterns that could no longer be dismissed as temporary disruption. Training injuries, broken bones, burns, lacerations were arriving faster than supplies meant to treat them. Even before American troops faced sustained combat, hospitals were already improvising. Gauze was stretched thinner. Dressings were conserved. Sterile packages were opened only when absolutely necessary. Sterility, once assumed, had become conditional. The danger was not immediate death. It was what followed days later: infections that spread silently, wounds that refused to close, surgical sites that turned red, then black. The Army had learned this lesson before, in 1918, when infection killed more soldiers than bullets in some units. But memory did not equal preparedness. Penicillin, still hailed as a promise rather than a solution, existed only in laboratory quantities. Mass production would not arrive until later in the war. Sulfa drugs helped, but they were not cures. Clean wounds remained the single most effective barrier between injury and death. And clean wounds required sterile supplies at a scale never before attempted. The Navy faced the same problem, multiplied by distance. Ships carried limited medical stores. Pacific operations meant weeks between resupply. Salt water, humidity, and heat destroyed packaging not designed for tropical conditions. Once sterility was broken, supplies became liabilities instead of assets. Procurement officers soon realized something uncomfortable. This was not simply a supply chain delay. It was a structural failure. American industry knew how to make medical products, but not how to make them in quantities large enough, sterile enough, and fast enough to sustain global war. Civilian manufacturers have been built for hospitals, clinics, and pharmacies. Their production lines emphasize precision, not volume. Sterilization relied on methods that could not be easily scaled: steam, manual handling, careful packaging. Each step slowed output. Each error risked contamination. The Army's demands grew faster than any single company's capacity. At the same time, labor shortages began to appear. Skilled workers left factories for uniform. Raw materials were redirected toward weapons production. Even paper, essential for packaging sterile supplies, became rationed. Medical manufacturing found itself competing against tanks, ships, and aircraft for priority. Yet casualties did not wait for priorities to be resolved. By the spring of 1942, planners estimated that upcoming operations in North Africa and the Pacific would require medical supplies in quantities several times higher than current production. Not in a year, not in 6 months. Immediately. It was in this moment that attention turned to a company that had quietly specialized in sterility long before the war. Johnson & Johnson was not the largest industrial firm in America. It did not produce weapons or vehicles. What it did produce, surgical dressings, sterile gauze, bandages, had once been considered mundane. Before the war, its business model rested on consistency and medical trust, not emergency scale. But unlike many manufacturers, Johnson & Johnson already understood something essential. Sterility was not a feature added at the end. It was a process embedded from the beginning. As military officials studied the problem, they began to see that winning the medical war would not come from inventing something new, but from expanding something that already existed faster than anyone believed possible. And in 1942, that realization pushed Johnson & Johnson from the margins of wartime planning into the center of an industrial emergency that would reshape both medicine and war. For the men arriving at military hospitals in 1942, survival did not end when the bleeding stopped. It continued in the hours and days that followed, when a wound either healed or turned against the body that carried it. Medics understood this intimately. Many had trained in civilian hospitals, where supplies were abundant and protocols rigid. Now they worked in environments shaped by speed and scarcity. They cleaned wounds, knowing that one compromised bandage could undo everything. They watched patients recover, then decline. Fever arrived quietly. Infection rarely announced itself until it was too late. Letters home spoke carefully of injuries but avoided the real fear. Not bullets, not shrapnel, but what might grow unseen beneath the dressing. Infections extended hospital stays, delayed returns to duty, and claimed lives without drama. Each case added pressure to a system already stretched thin. Every reusable dressing was a calculated risk. Every open package mattered. In the early 1940s, medicine did not yet possess the chemical answers it would later rely upon. Antibiotics were not ubiquitous. Surgical success depended on controlling bacteria through physical means: clean instruments, sterile dressings, sealed wounds. Medical journals of the period emphasized one consistent truth: infection rates dropped sharply when sterile protocols were followed. But protocols assumed supply. Without sterile materials, even the best-trained surgeons were fighting blind. Field hospitals were particularly vulnerable. Dust, heat, and humidity worked against cleanliness. Without reliable sterile packaging, supplies could be compromised before reaching the patient. Once compromised, they could not be trusted. This reality transformed gauze from a commodity into a weapon. American industry could build tanks by the thousands, but sterile medical production obeyed different rules. You could not simply accelerate the line. Sterility required time, controlled environments, and careful handling. Factories were not clean rooms. Packaging had to protect against contamination during transport and storage. Sterilization processes slowed production rather than speeding it. Johnson & Johnson's pre-war operations reflected this reality. Its factories prioritized quality over speed. Scaling meant rethinking not just output, but every step from raw material to sealed package. And by early 1942, the gap between military need and industrial capacity was growing faster than either side expected. The suffering was visible. The science was understood. The limitation was structural. And pressure was mounting to overcome it. Inside Johnson & Johnson's executive offices, the war arrived not with bombs, but with numbers. Requests from the Army and Navy were no longer measured in incremental increases. They were exponential. Orders demanded volumes that exceeded existing annual capacity, delivered in months. Company leadership understood the risk immediately. Scaling sterile production was not like expanding a conventional factory line. Failure did not mean delays. It meant contaminated supplies reaching wounded men. It meant lives lost quietly, far from headlines. Yet refusal was not an option. Meetings between company executives and military procurement officers were direct, often uncomfortable. Timelines were compressed. Specifications tightened. The military needed guarantees that sterility would hold from factory floor to jungle and desert. Johnson & Johnson needed labor, materials, and priority access in an economy already straining under total war. The decisions made in early 1942 would define the company's future. Entire product lines were redirected toward military use. Civilian distribution was reduced. Capital investment accelerated under wartime uncertainty. Factories were expanded before demand stabilized. An industrial gamble driven by necessity rather than profit. Sterilization had always been precise. Now it had to become massive. Johnson & Johnson engineers worked to adapt existing methods, steam, pressure, heat, into systems capable of continuous operation. Packaging became as critical as production. Materials had to remain sealed through shipping, storage, and extreme climates. Paper, adhesives, and wrapping techniques were redesigned to maintain integrity under heat and humidity. Quality control intensified rather than relaxed. Sampling increased. Failure rates were tracked obsessively. Sterility testing slowed output, but abandoning it was unthinkable. This was not innovation in the dramatic sense. No single breakthrough solved the problem. Progress came from hundreds of small adjustments, repeated endlessly under relentless deadlines. The question lingered quietly beneath the expansion. What did obligation mean in wartime? Johnson & Johnson remained a private company. It employed civilians. It paid wages. It had shareholders. Yet the scale of suffering attached to its products stripped the situation of abstraction. Cause was no longer inventory. It was survival. Government contracts provided financial stability, but they also imposed scrutiny. Pricing, margins, and production choices were watched closely. The company walked a narrow line, maintaining operations without exploiting crisis. For many inside the factories, the connection was personal. Brothers, sons, and neighbors were uniforms. Every crate that left the loading dock carried an unspoken destination, someone's wound. By mid-1942, Johnson & Johnson was no longer simply responding to demand. It was reshaping itself around a single reality, that medical logistics would decide outcomes long before the first shot was fired. And soon, the system they were building would be tested under the full weight of war. By the summer of 1942, the balance broke. American forces were no longer preparing for war. They were fighting it. Landings in North Africa were being planned. The Pacific Campaign was already consuming men and material at a pace that surpassed early projections. Casualty reports began to arrive with regularity, not as warnings, but as data, numbers that translated directly into supply requirements. For the medical system, this was the moment of truth. Johnson & Johnson's expanded factories were running at capacity, yet the orders kept growing. The Army Medical Department revised its estimates upward again and again. Each revision carried the same implication. What had been ambitious in January was now insufficient by July. Production lines stretched across long factory floors, operating in continuous shifts. Workers rotated through exhausting schedules. New employees, many of them women entering industrial work for the first time, were trained rapidly, then retrained when errors appeared. Sterility allowed no shortcuts. One lapse could contaminate an entire batch. Failures happened. Packaging seals broke under stress tests. Sterilization cycles had to be recalibrated. Shipments were delayed, rejected, or reprocessed. Every setback echoed forward, widening the gap between need and delivery. Meanwhile, The military clock did not slow. Field hospitals reported rising infection rates in tropical environments. Supplies arrived damaged by heat or moisture. In some cases, medical officers were forced to choose between using compromised materials or leaving wounds untreated. Neither option was acceptable. The pressure intensified from every direction. Procurement officers demanded guarantees. Military planners demanded numbers. Engineers demanded time. There was not enough of any of them. Inside Johnson & Johnson, the war effort consumed everything else. Civilian markets shrank to shadows. Research projects were postponed. Capital was poured into expansion without certainty of return. New sterilization equipment was installed before operators were fully trained. Warehouses filled, emptied, then filled again. The company was no longer scaling cautiously. It was racing, and still, it was not clear whether the system would hold. The decisive question was no longer whether Johnson & Johnson could produce sterile supplies, but whether those supplies could survive the journey from factory to frontline intact, reliable, and sufficient. The answer would come not from reports or meetings, but from the wounded men whose survival depended on what arrived in those crates. The proof arrived quietly. By late 1942 and in 1943, medical officers in North Africa and the Pacific began reporting a change. Not dramatic, not immediate, but measurable. Wounds that once festered now healed. Surgical sites stayed clean longer. Infection rates, though still present, began to fall. The difference was not a miracle drug. It was consistency. Crates arrived sealed. Dressings remained sterile despite heat and transport. Field hospitals could plan instead of improvise. Surgeons trusted what they opened. Medics worked faster, with confidence that each bandage did what it was meant to do. Behind those moments lay an industrial achievement few soldiers ever saw. Johnson & Johnson's scaled sterilization system stabilized. Packaging improvements held. Quality control, once feared as a bottleneck, became a safeguard rather than a delay. Output increased without sacrificing reliability. By 1943, the Army Medical Department could report improvements in survival rates tied directly to wound care. Infection no longer dominated casualty outcomes the way it had in earlier conflicts. Antibiotics would later amplify these gains, but the foundation had already been laid. The logistical network adjusted in response. Medical supply became predictable rather than reactive. Planning shifted from crisis management to sustainment. Field manuals were updated. Training reflected new realities. The transformation did not eliminate suffering. War never does, but it narrowed the gap between injury and recovery. It turned survival into an expectation rather than a gamble. For Johnson & Johnson, the turning point carried a different weight. The company had proven that sterile production could scale without collapse. What began as emergency adaptation became a permanent capability. And as the war pushed forward into Italy, across the Pacific, toward Europe, the quiet success of sterile medical supply moved with it, saving lives without fanfare, shaping outcomes without headlines. The war's momentum had shifted, and with it, the understanding that medicine, when industrialized with care, could alter the arithmetic of conflict. By the end of 1943, the effects of scaled sterile production were no longer anecdotal. They appeared in reports, tables, and comparisons that told a quieter story of the war, one written not in victories, but in recoveries. The Army Medical Department recorded steady declines in post-operative infection rates across multiple theaters. Wounds that once required amputation healed with limb intact. Hospital stays shortened. Return to duty timelines improved. In some units, infection-related deaths dropped to fractions of what they had been during World War I. These changes altered more than medical outcomes. They reshaped strategy. Commanders could plan operations knowing that wounded men had a higher chance of survival. Evacuation chains became more efficient. Field hospitals were no longer overwhelmed by secondary complications. Medical personnel spent less time fighting preventable infections and more time stabilizing acute injuries. The Pacific, once feared for its medical hazards, became manageable rather than catastrophic. Sterile supplies held under heat and humidity. Packaging designed for war proved itself under pressure. The burden of disease and infection, though never eliminated, lost its status as the primary threat. For the men on the ground, the difference was personal. Survival no longer depended as heavily on luck. Clean wounds meant futures, returns home, families resumed, lives continued beyond the war. Institutionally, the military took note. Sterile supply was elevated from logistical detail to strategic necessity. Procurement systems were redesigned. Stockpiling became standard. Medical logistics earned a permanent place alongside ammunition and fuel in planning documents. What had begun as a crisis response now became doctrine. And as the war moved toward its final years, the consequences of those early 1942 decisions extended far beyond the battlefield, reaching into the future of medicine itself. By 1945, the United States had emerged from the war not only victorious, but with a transformed medical infrastructure. Johnson & Johnson's wartime expansion had established factories, processes, and standards that would endure far beyond military needs. Sterile production, once a limited craft, had become industrialized, capable of delivering massive volumes reliably and safely. Hospitals across the country adopted the methods proven in war. Hospitals in Europe and Asia, rebuilt after conflict, looked to American models for sterile supply chains. Packaging, sterilization, and logistics developed under duress became foundational elements of modern healthcare. Surgical mortality dropped. Infection control became standard practice. The lessons of 1942 reverberated through every operating room, every clinic, and every emergency ward for decades to come. Johnson & Johnson itself was permanently transformed. The company retained the factories, trained personnel, and industrial rigor honed during wartime. Its role in national defense became a permanent part of its identity, shaping corporate culture, research priorities, and production philosophy. Civilian medicine benefited from systems designed initially for combat, providing safer, more reliable care for generations. The war also left a lasting impression on the military. Planners understood that logistics could be as decisive as firepower. Sterile supply chains became an integral part of operational planning. No longer could commanders rely solely on weapons and manpower. Medical preparedness became inseparable from combat strategy. Yet the human dimension remained. Every life saved through sterile care reflected countless decisions, innovations, and risks taken in boardrooms, factories, and hospital wards. The invisible infrastructure of gauze, bandages, and sterile dressings quietly altered the calculus of war, reducing suffering in a conflict defined by destruction. In the end, the lessons of 1942 extended far beyond battlefields. They reshaped how industry, medicine, and the military approached human survival, proving that in war, as in peace, preparation, precision, and scale could save more lives than heroism alone. War is often measured in tanks, bullets, and territory. Yet in 1942, a quieter battle was being fought, a battle fought not with guns, but with gauze, bandages, and sterile packaging. Lives were won not by firepower, but by foresight, industrial ingenuity, and the relentless application of science under pressure. The crisis revealed an essential truth. Human survival depends on the systems behind the front lines. Johnson & Johnson's rapid scaling of sterile production did not make headlines. It left no monuments, but it saved countless lives, shortened suffering, and allowed the American military to operate with confidence that the wounded could recover. It proved that medicine, when industrialized and disciplined, could become a force multiplier on a scale previously unimaginable. Beyond the war, these lessons persisted. Hospitals adopted standardized sterile procedures. Surgical outcomes improved. Industrial production of medical supplies became a permanent fixture of national readiness. The experience of 1942 transformed both the company and the practice of medicine, showing that preparation, precision, and scale could be as decisive as courage and strategy. In the end, the story of America's medical crisis and its solution is a story of quiet heroism. It is a reminder that wars are not only fought with weapons, but with systems, science, and human ingenuity. Sterility became an unseen weapon, one that shaped the course of the war and reshaped the future of healthcare forever.